see where this moment in the life of Christ occurs, the beginning of the church, the calling of the disciples, and so on. Now first let us say that Jesus was raised as an Orthodox Jew. He would have gone to the 2 levels of schooling that were prepared for the laity and had had his bar mitzvah and so on. But then he would learn to become a carpenter. And he worked with Joseph for a period of time, and Joseph died. Jesus, being the oldest brother, took over the responsibility of family, and with Mary, stood accountable to make provision for the rest of the kids. You and I often miss the aspects of humanity that touch the life and fullness of Jesus. Today, we come to that part where he has now reached an age and apparently made a decision, been selected of God to begin the ministry to the world. You'll remember quickly that we say our Lord Jesus Christ, true God, begotten of eternity, but also true man, born of the Virgin Mary, is my Lord. And it is this God-man who now takes on the task of ministry to the world. It doesn't come without struggle, however, because he is faced with the temptations that often come to people in position of prominence and service. He could have given in. He could have renounced the virtue of following the Lord and his precepts, but he chose rather to maintain a sustaining faith, not on the basis of his divinity, but on the strength of his humanity enlightened by God and the Holy Spirit. It is said, and especially later it is said, Jesus even says, I could have called legions of angels, but I didn't. Why? Because the victory of that initial struggle had to come with the capacity of what it is to be human, strengthened by the presence and gifts of God to endure what we're confronting, even temptation, to be less committed, to think of ourselves primarily, or even to distort things into half-truths. Jesus chose not any one of those alternatives, but chose rather, through the Word, through the presence of God, through prayer, and through the radical commitment of himself as a human being, to overcome every temptation that would dissuade him from the ministry to which he was called. Now, secondly, having passed through this private triumph, he begins his ministry. He is quite successful right from the beginning. Oh, it is true that in one section of Samaria, as he traveled through, they finally gave up on the Samaritans and said, no good is coming to this, we might as well keep on going. But Jesus persisted, and in this time, he selected his disciples, picking each one. And then they, in turn, with the population that have responded to Jesus' preaching, teaching, and healing, formed an amalgam of people who followed Jesus around from place to place. Jesus had trouble getting quiet time for himself, for the crowd was so impressed with his miracles, his preaching, his clarity of teaching, and his healing, that they were enthusiastic to move with this man whom they now recognize and begin to acknowledge as the Messiah of God, the one whom the Lord would send. There was some ambiguity, of course, because the popular notion of the Messiah to come would be one who would come in power, demand status, and in effect would suppress the world to his power and to his claim. Jesus chose rather, in what Paul designates here in the earlier lesson, the weakness of God rather than the power of the world. And he makes his commitment in that regard. He also is successful for a lot of reasons. Now, obviously, one reason would be some of the spectacular miracles. For example, the death of the son of the widow of Nain. She was a woman who was a widow and whose only relative was her son, a young man, and he dies. She is confounded because she goes in effect to his funeral. And there, because of Jesus' heart-rending plight for her, he intercedes and he brings the boy back to life. Imagine what it is to lose someone that young, to be that alone, and then by the hand of Jesus, to be restored to the loved one that meant so much. Crowds followed him. Now, on one occasion, of course, Jesus says, you followed me not because you were interested in what I was saying, but because you ate your fill. Not too different than human beings today. Now, what do we find out about this? Number one, he overcame the obstacles to his ministry, became intensely popular, and then calls the 12 disciples. As they walk and work along, they're confronted by many individual opportunities for preaching and teaching, and then Jesus says, let's go apart. And he withdraws, and then the disciples come after, and he's going to teach them. Now, you and I would be very proud to get into that seminar, wouldn't we? If we could announce that in 2 weeks, Jesus will be here for a period of 8 days, and he's going to open the Scriptures and do the revelation of God, and for our deeper understanding and feeling and mission and capacity to teach. We would be jammed with people. Now, there we have a problem with expectation levels. And that is that the presumption of spending time with Jesus, even in retreat, would bring this group of 12 around to have the strength, the wisdom, and the commitment that was going to be demanded of them in a matter of, let's say, 2.5 years. It ranged everything from, yes, Lord, we'll follow you to the ends of the earth, to doubting Thomas raising issue as to whether or not he's the real thing. They were very human in their response. Point 2. See, point 1 was Jesus, on the power of his humanity, with the help of God, could endure and bear what he must in order to serve. Now, 2, the men and women that he selected were far from perfection, often quick to fault, abrupt in their decisions, and others slow and languid to carry on and to even catch on, even if that seminar with Jesus was given directly to them. Now, what does this tell us? This tells us that the power of humanity has always been that with God, all things are possible. But the other thing we learn is that it has to be possible with ordinary people. And as we look at the disciples in particular, other people associated with them, crowds which were strongly in favor of Jesus, but wanted him to return as the promised Messiah, that is, with earthly power, and force the world into a worshiping configuration. He refuses to do that. He comes rather with the weaknesses of God. And he alludes to them today in particular. And I'm only going to deal with a couple of them. But for example, we're told that when Jesus saw them, then he said, "Blessed are those who mourn." I don't know if you've ever considered yourself as being blessed of God when you're in a state of sorrow. Having lost a loved one near and dear to you, your disposition is not likely to be one of joy and reassurance and certainty. It's more apt to be one of questioning concerning the absence of the beloved and the inadequacy of the struggle alone. Nevertheless, Jesus says, "Blessed are you who mourn, for you will be comforted." Notice he doesn't say you will be an exception to the human race and never lose anyone you love. He says it's quite consistent from a point of view of generation to lose those you know and love. But you will be strengthened, and you will be enabled to endure the loneliness, the loss, the doubting, and the weakness of faith. Rather, in a moment that cannot be described as joyful, you will taste of the real first fruits of the Spirit, that even in adversity, the Lord provides. Blessed are you who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for you will be filled. Yeah, but see, I still got to make a living, right? How is it that I'm going to switch the focus of my concern of life, of taking care of myself, of making provision for my loved ones, of entering out into the world and struggling with its values, that I can now come and say, but nevertheless, my hunger and my thirst should be for righteousness and the gifts of God first. And then by necessity or amendment, the secondary concerns which seem so primary in the struggle for daily life. Blessed are you. Blessed are those who are merciful, for they will obtain mercy. I think if we went down a list of people and we see what has happened in terms of assassinations, imprisonments, that often the people of the highest and most noble understandings are the ones whom society lights upon and destroys them, does not give them extra leverage. But Jesus in this teaching makes explicit the fact not that you again are an exception to the human race, but that as one of the human races, God will make provision. Oh, blessed are you, for you will inherit the earth. Now, you've all heard that bad statement that goes around and say, blessed are they who will inherit the earth. And somebody will say, yeah, all 6 feet of it, right, Pastor? No. This inheritance is not marked by yards and feet. This inheritance is not marked by possession. It is marked rather that everything that the Lord has to give, every possibility will be afforded each of you. And where that lacks in substance or quantity, the time will come when it will be rectified, and God will make it right again. This set of Beatitudes are many things. They can be sermons in themselves, but one thing they are is a strong and cardinal statement that irrespective of the circumstance, God can and will make provision so that those who cling to His Word, remain faithful to His truth, will receive the blessedness, the aurora of God around them to sustain them even in the worst of conditions. And at the end of time, if not before, God will make right so many things that seem so very wrong because of the sin of people. Then by the act of God, God having selected the least, the lonely, the lost, the alienated, the separated, will receive. And let me make very clear, you can be well off from a worldly point of view and still be among that group of people who are alone, alienated, separated from God, and without the provision to go ahead, even in the least desirable of circumstances. The Lord will make provision. Now, one last thing we must say and must incorporate in our understanding. What we're discussing is the real world as confronted by ordinary people who, however, are under the aegises of God, which gives them a moral and often physical, strength to endure what they must as long as they're called upon to do it. For those of us in relatively good shape, and you see how I include myself in that. For those of us in relatively good shape, we have to be satisfied with what blessings come even under the condition of declining states, loss of strength. One thing, however, has not diminished. One thing is not diluted, and that is that in each of the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are you," and that the Lord will make provision for you. He'll enable you to endure as Jesus Christ endured the entrance to his own ministry. And he enabled you, even as an ordinary human being with foibles and fails and sins and need, to persist. And you are to persist in the victory of God over the most intolerable circumstances of daily life, knowing that you are among the blessed that Jesus anoints as his own and claims you with the certainty that you will follow, that you'll be faithful unto death when you receive the crown of life.